you personally have to overcome with imposter syndrome?
So when you mentioned in my bio that I studied psychology, that was my first love, still remains the thing that I think most about and that I'm most passionate about. But for various reasons, I did not go in the direction I thought I would, which was to become a clinical psychologist, go on to get a PhD. And so when I decided not to do that, I pivoted into the high tech space right at the peak of the dot-com boom. Everyone was hiring, didn't matter what your background was. And I suddenly found myself thrust into this world that I thought I never would be part of and never really wanted to be part of. But I had a lot of enthusiasm and I really embraced the people side of business. I was a relationship manager. And so part of it was really fun, but I found myself in conversations and on teams with engineers and product managers and super techy people. And I felt like they were speaking a foreign language that I had no dictionary for. And I would sit there and think, oh my God, someone's going to ask me a question and everyone's going to find out I have no business being in this room. So it was like this daily fear of being exposed. And it was so overwhelming that I felt like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. There was a time when I actually started to think, I need to move to consumer goods. Like Gillette was big at the time. I'm like, razors, I can understand. I cannot understand technology.
These tech people, I know. I'm in tech too. So every time we talk, I'm like, I relate.
Yeah. So that's really at the heart of my own experience with imposter syndrome, was constantly telling myself that I needed to be able to speak to these engineers at their level. To me, now in hindsight, how I think about it is thinking you have to know every detail of how a car works in order to drive it. But at the time, that felt really important. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm never going to catch up. They know so much more than I do. And it was this constant competition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And in that place too, it goes back to what we were just saying. It kept you small, right? Because you weren't able to contribute your ideas that they aren't thinking about. We think different in our roles. So me in sales, I think different than an engineer, but I can contribute a lot as far as project plan, resourcing, relationship building, what actually needs to get done so that they can do their things. And it took me a long time too to find my voice, because it's scary when you're surrounded by people that are like super, super smart and you're like, oh my God, do I deserve to be here? Do I belong? So I appreciate you sharing the vulnerability in that, because I'm sure the listeners can relate that maybe they're sitting in a room where they are surrounded by perceived smarter people, but all of us have the value to create impact and change.
Exactly. And I think for me, the big revelation was, oh, I'm not in the room for the same reason as Bob from engineering. For me, and I think for so many high achievers, there's this feeling of I need to know everything, do everything, be everything myself. And I liken it to like a Swiss Army knife. We think we have to be the whole Swiss Army knife, every tool in the knife. That's what the team is for. There's a reason why we have salespeople and engineers and product managers. If everybody were playing the same role, we'd be redundant. And I think when we find ourselves in those situations, our brains just start to go into threat mode and we think, oh no, I'm not good enough. When in actuality, we're not meant to compete with the guy from the other part of the business. We're there to complement each other, right?
Right. I think that's a really nice word, compliment. That's very true. So we talked just now a little bit about overcoming imposter syndrome and what you personally went through. Now that you speak about this all the time and you're working with both corporations and individual clients, what's been your biggest aha or lesson around imposter syndrome?
Well, the one that comes to mind first, I'm not sure if it's the biggest, but the one that comes to mind first, I think, is what I've learned as an entrepreneur and what I wish I knew back in the day. And I used to think that there was this guidebook or playbook that everyone else had access to that I didn't have. Like everyone else had the manual and they all knew the rules and I didn't know what those were. And I was just fumbling my way through it. And as an entrepreneur, and now you probably experience this too, right? Like when you're talking to corporations or you're talking to people about opportunities and you realize everyone's just making it up as they go along. That is such a liberating thing for me. I was like, oh, here I am thinking I have to compete with all these super smart people who know the way. And I am this outsider who hasn't figured it out yet. When in actuality, everybody's just creating and we're all just making it up as we go along. And there's great value in that too, because to be innovative and competitive, we need to be able to think differently and not just follow a prescribed set of rules. And I think for women in particular, we tend to be obedient. It's how we were raised. And so we think like, oh, I can't color outside the lines. I can't have this conversation because it would be overstepping, as opposed to thinking of it as just because it hasn't been done this way before doesn't mean it can't be done this way. And that gives us so much more freedom to be ourselves.
Absolutely. And I love that you went there, because it's just like, as I think of being a sales leader and posting for positions and stuff, I would have qualified women on my team that wouldn't submit for promotions because they didn't feel ready enough. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? They're like, well, I only feel like I'm 70% there. And I'm like, well, that's good enough. Like, guess what? We don't have it all figured out. But you bring up a very valid point that I think is beneficial. So listeners, you don't have to have it all figured out before you move. Like, move and build, it's okay.
Yes. And if you do have it all figured out before you move, then you're going to be underpaid and undervalued, because that's not going to challenge you at all. It's going to be really boring. And so I think that we are the only ones who expect ourselves to have pre-mastered something before we even started.
I would agree 100%. So I'm going to move the question in a different direction. Why are you passionate about this work? What have you seen as outcomes?
So I really tie it all back to when I started the conversation about imposter syndrome, it was really designed to help individual people address their pain. But as I've gotten deeper into the work, I really see its roots in a lack of inclusion and psychological safety in the workplace. And there's certainly individual elements to this. We all bring our own quote unquote baggage to every situation that we come into. But I do think that workplaces trigger us in ways that we don't recognize. And I think there's so much opportunity for workplaces to pay more attention to the human experience. And so for me, psychological safety is so critical for people to be able to feel like they can share their ideas without being judged, for people to feel like it's a safe space to learn and that people will make mistakes and they're not going to be a catastrophe that follows from that. And so I just really believe that if we can focus on getting psychological safety right, that inclusion will follow, that people will feel more respected, they will be able to give more of themselves. And as we've been talking about, everybody benefits from that. I get the sense of fulfillment of bringing my gifts to the world, but the whole system benefits from having people who are fully present, who are able to share and work together in a more collaborative way.
You said so many things that I could just go off on, but there's one piece that I want to grab and take forward. And that is this piece. You mentioned psychological safety, but you mentioned inclusion and innovation. And I think it's important. So we've talked a lot about the individual, but for leaders out there from the corporation perspective, offering safety to your employees gets you the innovation you need to not fall behind. And then, Kim, I want you, as the expert, to talk more about this. But as I've specialized in work-life empowerment and burnout, what I've learned is when employees don't feel safe, they're not contributing. And so when you, as a leader, are saying, Sally isn't speaking up and sharing ideas in meetings, that should be your cue that Sally doesn't feel safe. There's nothing wrong with Sally. There's something from a psychology perspective that makes her feel unsafe, that she can't share. And so I want you to talk more about that, because I feel like that's the underlying thing that's really happening in corporations that isn't getting enough light yet. It's starting to, but I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and I love the way that you painted that picture of an individual who has great potential but is not contributing. And it is so easy to attribute that to, oh, she's just not performing, they're not meeting expectations, when in actuality, it is likely rooted in this safety conversation. And when we don't feel safe, we go into self-preservation mode. And when we're in self-preservation mode, we don't problem solve. We don't create, we don't collaborate. It's all about risk avoidance. It's all about, how do I tiptoe around the landmine so that nothing bad happens to me? And when you've got a critical mass of people in your organization that are all behaving that way, you're not leading, you're not innovating, like you said, you're not creating new things. You've just got a whole bunch of people that are worried that something bad is going to happen. And so it seems so obvious to those of us who live and breathe this, but it's still such a foreign concept to so many leaders who have been taught these more command and control kinds of leadership styles. And if you've ever been a parent, leading with fear does not inspire.